Good evening and welcome to tonight's King's Talk on the historical significance of the beautiful city of Vienna, with particular reference to the early 20th century. My name is Greg Hunter and I am the Deputy Head Co-Curricular at King's. Tonight we are delighted to welcome our current Head of Research in Arts and Humanities, Dr. David Perkins, to provide this talk. He has a lifelong interest in Vienna's history. David recently completed a 10-year stint as Head of History at King's, and in the past has completed a doctorate at the University of Cambridge. Tonight's talk will take two parts. Firstly, Dr. Perkins will be providing us a presentation, and then he'll be taking questions from you, the audience, through either the Zoom Q&A or by putting your virtual hand up. Now, it's with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Perkins. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The end of the world began in Vienna, 1900, so they say. Apparently, the principal sources of modernism can be traced back to the clash of ideologies in a single overlooked European city. There was a spectacular outburst of cultural creativity, as well as the discovery or invention of psychological man. Sigmund Freud diagnosed the discontents of civilization. Disillusioned with politics, Freud interpreted dreams. Vienna possessed a dreamlike quality. Hermann Brock noted, the city was a dream and the emperor a dream within the dream. Even before 1914, there was a sense of a society on the verge of collapse. New forces of mass politics and demagoguery were unleashed in a feverish atmosphere that would have profound consequences for the future. Hermann Brock, recalling the pastries and the waltzes, thought that Vienna at least had suffered a joyful apocalypse. Hermann Bahr declared there was a virtuosity in nervousness. Meanwhile, the musicians of the Second Viennese School specialized in atonal anguish. But Vienna just wasn't ready for this new music. In 1913, Arnold Schoenberg faced an angry mob when he conducted works by Berg, Webern, together with his own chamber symphony. Violence broke out. Oscar Strauss, who was the composer of the operetta Waltz Dream, punched the president of the Avant-Garde Society for Literature and Music. In 1980, Karl E. Koshka produced a remarkable book, Fin de siècle Vienna, Politics and Culture. He wasn't the first to write about Fin de siècle Vienna, but he put forward a powerful theory. He argued that those who created modernism did so out of alienation when their liberal political structure was brought to an end around 1900. Frustrated by the loss of political power, frustrations over the loss of political power gave rise to psychoanalysis, atonality in music, new aestheticism in literature, painting and theatre, architecture, as well as in lifestyles. Koshka said there was an unusually high concentration of artistic and intellectual innovation. Koshka said that these innovators symbolized the other cultural and social changes characterized by their alienation and independence from the past. For Koshka, Vienna proved to be a historical hothouse because of its homogeneous nature, its manageable size, and cafe culture played a major role in spreading ideas. It's possible to look at the cultural life in Vienna around the time of 1900 as a series of intersecting circles or constellations of activity. The Vienna Circles model is an abstraction from the complex reality. There were interconnections, certainly, but there were also missed encounters. For instance, Hitler, Stalin, and Trotsky could all have met over a coffee at the famous Central Café Central. They were all in town in early 1913. Perhaps it happened, perhaps it didn't. As well as circles, there were also contrasts. There were also contrasts and unexpected pairings. Here we have Richard Strauss and Hugo von Hofmannsthal. The two men scarcely met, but the two exchanged letters over a period of 29 years. Artistic collaboration by the medium of letter would be inconceivable today. Here comes Freud. Freud coined new psychological terms such as the Oedipus complex, defense mechanism, death instinct, repression. He was one of the radicals, but at the same time, his lifestyle was very conventional. His meals were exactly on the hour. He strolled the Ringstrasse every day. His barber trimmed his beard daily. He played cards with the same people every Saturday night. He was always faultlessly dressed. Freud is not exactly what you'd imagine a creative person looks like. Here we have Adolf Hitler, author of World Destruction. He tops every list of infamy. Much has been written about Hitler, but he always seems elusive. He was a man who sought to control the future, but he also sought to censor and control the past. People have often asked, where did this monster come from? Hitler's childhood is familiar: the overbearing father, the doting mother, the willful artistic boy, the willful boy with artistic dreams. What's less well known is that Hitler was 6 days older than Wittgenstein, and they actually went to the same school. I don't think they were the same school in Linz, but I don't think they were bosom buddies. Hitler arrived in Vienna from Linz intending to be an artist or an architect, but he became an alienated drifter, a consumer, an avid consumer of fake news. His later book, Mein Kampf, contained scarcely an original thought. He picked up almost everything in Vienna. Here, by contrast, we have Felix Salten, author of Bambi. He sold the rights for $1,000. It was published in 1923, translated into English in 1929, became a Disney film in 1941-42. Let's look at some art. Let's look at Gustav Klimt. Klimt was the son of a goldsmith who went to art school, and he was a prodigy. Success came to him early. His works became hugely popular. He was a superstar who was revered and sometimes reviled in equal measure. He was the chief organizer of the Vienna session, consisting of a group of artists reacting against the stale past art of the 19th century. Here you can see a kind of contrast that Schiele would have talked about, contrast between the representational realism on one side and his new kind of language of art, his symbolist, sensuous style. Klimt's work, his later work in particular, bursts with pattern and meaning. It's as if his motto was, more is better. Here's some more Klimt. We have a painting on the right of Margaret Stoneborough Wittgenstein, who's the daughter of the wealthy industrialist Wittgenstein. The Wittgenstein family are touched by success as well as tragedy. The three elder brothers committed suicide. The rest became fairly famous. Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, Paul, a concert pianist, and Margaret was active in the arts world. Here we have the development of Klimt's style. The subject wears a white dress. Klimt enjoyed the white on white. And in the background, there is a kind of Art Nouveau style there. Margaret didn't like the painting and had it consigned to the attic of her summer house. On the left, we have the dress designer, Amelia Flerger, who is presented as a kind of bejeweled beauty. She and her family didn't like the painting either. So that's something they had in common, but it shows that the kind of it's a kind of radical image for the time. We next go to one of the most famous images of Klimt, the kind of chocolate box image of Klimt, the kiss. And it presents an embracing couple cloaked in a cocoon almost, protecting them from harm. It kind of suggests the immortality of their love. The man is coated with kind of repeating geometric patterns representing masculinity, and the woman with circles and flowers representing femininity. But they're both kind of untouched by reality. They've moved away from history. They're abstracted figures. This is the height of Klimt's golden phase, influenced by his father's career as a goldsmith. There's kind of a powdered gold coating, a shimmering background. In the museum, in the Belvedere Museum in Vienna, they got bored with so many people taking selfies. They've actually created a full-size copy in the museum, and they've called it the selfie point. Here we have another Klimt painting from his golden period, Adolf Bloch-Bauer. A woman stares out, beautiful, serene, floating, disembodied. She's one of a group of wealthy Jewish women, the sort of Jewish woman that Freud liked to psychoanalyze. Klimt immortalized her in this painting. He produced a lot of society paintings, 5 or 6 a year, and charged the equivalent of about 100,000 US dollars a pop. Adolf Bloch, the pair were very close, and he's the only woman that Klimt painted twice, but there's quite a contrast between the second one where Adolf Bloch-Bauer is presented as a kind of vertical tower in the middle. There's a way in which some Klimt's women kind of disappear into the wallpaper. Here we have Egon Schiele. You could say that Egon Schiele ranks as one of the century's most screwed up artists. He was only 28 when he died in 1918. Like Klimt, he was swept away in the flu pandemic. Schiele's career, like many prodigies, was brief but productive. He was the son of a station master. He went to art school. He met Klimt in 1907, and then his distinctive style began to emerge. Now, he's very, very skilled at painting the human form, almost always showing the body in isolation from its surroundings. He famously painted pictures of starved-looking nudes that were all elbows, knees, spidery fingers, contorted limbs. He seemed to be saying that even a bony body could be sensual. Here we have Schiele's painting of the publisher Edward Kosmak from 1910, which again shows a disturbing image, an uneasiness that seemed to be prevalent in Vienna at the time. With Schiele, you see the body as a kind of a straitjacket, a kind of prison of the soul, and these were common expressionist themes. Schiele wasn't the first expressionist that in Vienna. That honor goes to Richardgerstel. Gerstel was alienated from the tight-knit circle of artists in Vienna. He was arrogant, he was super sensitive, he was short-tempered. His art was experimental. In 1908, he began an affair with Matilda Schoenberg, wife of the composer Arnold Schoenberg, and the dynamics of that affair seem to have made his art more radical. Faces blurred, backgrounds lapsing into chaos and abstraction. Arnold Schoenberg was having a simultaneous streak of creativity with his second string quartet, but as he finished it, he walked in on the pair and his wife briefly ran off with Gerstel. Schoenberg, who was also psychologically unstable, threatened suicide. Matilda went back to Schoenberg. Gerstel proved the most fragile of the two. He was devastated. He committed suicide in November 1908, aged 25, having destroyed much of his work. Here we have Oskar Koshka and Alma Mala. They have a dynamic. It isn't the only troubled relationship in Vienna at the time. Alma Mala has a kind of eye for talent. Consider the men she married or toyed with. Gustav Mahler, Oskar Koshka, Walter Gropius, Franz Werfel, all of them big hitters, but usually suffering from the same fatal flaw, possessiveness. There are also others too, Alexander von Zemlinsky, Osip Gabrilowicz, the playwright Gerhard Hauptmann. Alma's definitely, she was a talented artist. She sacrificed her own creative impulses to the ambitions of her men. Was she a serial betrayer? Because she seemed to fall for the same kind of temperamental artist. She devoted her life, at least for a while, to them, to their endeavors. And then she left them for the next artist or musician who came along. She's often seen as being a bit of a groupie of intellectuals and artists, but I imagine she didn't see herself quite that way. Her first love was reputed to have been Klimt. Kokoschka became obsessed with her. And this leads to his painting, the Bride of the Wind, The Tempest from 1914. Encouraged by Alma, he started to create a kind of expressionist style. And this can be seen in his painting, The Tempest, which shows a couple maybe on a boat or on a bed in a turbulent landscape. There are lots of stories about Oskar Kokoschka. like the time he found out that Alma had been cheating on him with one of his love rivals, the noted biologist Paul Kammerer. Later, when Alma Mala left him, Kammerer threatened to shoot himself on Mala's grave. Kammerer did experiments with toads. Alma and Oscar used to meet in Alma's summer villa. One day, Oscar arrived to find the living room filled with tanks of toads. Some of the toads had escaped, and there was a slimy orgy of frisky toads all over the floor. Here seemed to be viscous or vicious proof of Alma's infidelity. In a rage, Oscar threw the toads out of the house. He'd been at work on the Tempest for about a year, and the toads incident allegedly led him to retint the painting from its original red color to a more ominous blue-green color. Another story was that Alma promised to marry him if he produced a masterpiece. Unfortunately, she didn't, but Oskar Koshka became obsessed with Alma Mala, stalkerish. He even had a kind of life-size model made of her, which he used to take around with him. It all got a little bit weird. In August 1914, he sold the painting to a Berlin pharmacist. He bought a horse, a cavalry uniform, and a brass helmet. We saw that picture a moment ago, and a postcard was made of him. Koshka also painted the architect Adolf and the writer Peter Altenberg. Altenberg was a bit of a bohemian. He used to dress in kind of loose-fitting clothes and wear sandals in all weathers. He used to live in hotel rooms and counted his official dress as the Central Cafe. Today, the Central Cafe features a full life-size statue of him sitting at a table. Koshka's life didn't seem to make him that happy though. And you can see here the kind of almost a sense of kind of distress, a kind of intense color and kinetic handling of the paint, again suggesting expressionism. And here we have Koshka's painting of Adolf Loos, who a famous architect, who's a kind of model of intellectual rigor. The background here is a turbulent background. It's not like the Klimtian background. There's a kind of sense of turbulence and tumult. The clasped hands are kind of clenched together, almost like cogs. You could say that Koshka was the last survivor of fin de siècle Vienna. He died in 1980, but then I suppose you could also say maybe it's Bambi. Maybe Bambi is the last survivor of fin de siècle Vienna. Anyway, the coffee house. Here is Peter Altenberg sitting in the entrance of the Central Cafe. You know, the best place to observe the end of the world was in the coffee house. And here are some famous figures who frequented the Central Cafe. There's also the Cafe Greensteidl, which was famously, the building was famously demolished in 1897, and the satirist Karl Pla wrote an essay called Literature Demolished. The cafe has been reinstated. It was recreated in the 1990s. It's a bit of a kind of a fake cafe now, but I kind of like it. Moving to architecture, the Ringstrasse, the kind of great boulevard of Vienna created in the 1860s, had a whole series of buildings which kind of made a nod to the past, classical style for the Parliament building, the university, and the Renaissance style. And as development progressed, there's more and more eclectic architecture in Vienna. There's a reaction against this, a group of artists seeking a new way of producing architecture. So here it comes as a surprise after the kind of bombastic Ringstrasse architecture to come across a spare white building topped with a spherical dome, a dome of golden laurel leaves. It was known at the time by Vienna citizens as the Golden Cabbage. The architect, Josef Maria Ulbricht, answered his critics with the motto, "To every age its art, and to art its freedom." It was a reaction against the pomposity of 19th century architecture. I mean, it houses Klimt's Beethoven frieze, which is a huge frieze over 3 walls. Again, highly symbolized, highly psychologized, centralized frieze. Here we have, as an offshoot from the secession movement, we have the Wiener Werkstätte and one of its practitioners of arts and craft, Josef Hoffmann, who liked a lot of squares and rectangles. And you can see some of his backgrounds in the Klimt paintings. Also, Kollo Moser, who's also one of the founders of the Wiener Werkstätte, who preferred circles. So again, Otto Wagner, another secession architect, not far from the secession building is his Karls Pla Stadtbad station, with his favorite motif, the sunflower, and also one of my favorite buildings in Vienna, his Majolica house. He also produced the Post Sparkasse, the Post Office Savings Bank, which is another one of my favorite buildings. It combines functionality and beauty, kind of focuses on every detail. It's unusual for a building of that time to be completely modular. You can shift around the interior of it in a kind of strikingly modern way. It can be adapted and changed as needs change. One thing I forgot to mention about the Wiener Werkstätte is I think their designs are still used for there's a famous patisserie and cafe in Vienna called Demel, which is well worth a visit if you're in town. And I think they still use the Wiener Werkstätte designs for the pastry boxes. We saw a painting of Adolf Loos, and one summer years ago, I spent walking the streets of Vienna. And one day I found myself walking along a street counting house numbers until I came across number 10. You know, and I was a bit puzzled because this wasn't the stark facade I remembered from all the books. It didn't look like the house that had launched the modern style. You know, I couldn't understand where the house had got to. It took me a while walking around to realize that I was looking at the front of the house rather than the back. The front of the back it almost looks like a barrel almost, and is quite deceptive. Loos himself was born in what's now the Czech Republic, studied in the US for a while, worked in the US for a while, returned to Vienna and became a practitioner, innovator of modern architecture. He had a kind of obsession with simplicity, form, function, and lack of ornament. Here we have his house on Michaelerplatz, which is right opposite the entrance to the Habsburg Palace, the Hofburg. And it was very controversial at the time when it was built because it didn't seem to have any windowsills and was very simple, pared down. And Emperor Franz Joseph was a super conservative. You know, it's fair to say he wasn't really a huge fan of anything that could be construed as modern. And so he had all the windows, supposedly he had all the windows on the palace that faced the building shuttered, and he kind of refused to go out that way because he was offended. His sensibilities were offended by this striking building. Another favorite of mine is the Strudelhof Steps. This is a staircase, and actually this is a staircase produced by the local government. It's unusually stylish for something that's produced by a local authority. It was built in 1910. It seems unusually elegant. So there's a famous novel by Hemito von Doderer called The Strudelhof Steps, where most of the action sort of revolves around these kind of Art Nouveau, Jugendstil kind of steps. The central plot takes place there. There's a novel by Arnold Bennett called, I forget what it's called now. It's called The Royseman Steps, set in Clerkenwell, which is a similar kind of an idea, although this is a more complex novel. I kind of prefer this one though, I think, really. But there's a new translation to English coming out in 2021. So one summer again, I went to track down the staircase. You know, I tracked down the steps. I walked up and down. You know, I stood at the top, drink it in. The final thing I wanted to say in this rather seven-league boots approach to the history of Vienna is to say something about the modernist novelist Robert Musil. He's a contemporary of Proust, a contemporary of James Joyce, and he's a strikingly original thinker. And he produced a novel over the course of many years, a kind of unfinished novel called The Man Without Qualities, and it kind of represented a moment in history that exposes kind of universal conditions of character, states of psychology, social and political and sexual interactions, volatile or otherwise. The setting of his book is Vienna 1913, and he says in his notes that all the lines in the book lead to the war. But it's an ironic book, it's an ironic novel, and a few of the characters can see war coming, even though many of them are alert to the decadence of society. Most of the characters in the book are brought together through the activities of a parallel campaign. They're planning a vast international celebration for the 70th anniversary of the accession of Emperor Franz Joseph to the throne of Austria-Hungary. This is a celebration that will never take place, and the society collapses, and that foreshadows the apocalypse. He entitled one of the 3 volumes, Pseudo-Reality Prevails. History was set to collide with self-delusion. Everything comes to an end. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Perkins. Okay, so it is now time we will take your questions either 2 ways. Either type your questions into the Q&A of the Zoom function, or alternatively put your virtual hand up and I can put you directly on to ask David a question yourself. Just while we're waiting for the questions to come in, just on the coffee house, you know, when did that actually? You said they recreated in the 90s, was it? When was it actually? When did it stop in its current format?
The Café Greensteiner was demolished in 1897, or the building was demolished. It wasn't recreated until the 1990s. I think Vienna has a slightly awkward relationship to these innovators. Many of them were Jewish, and there's a kind of awkwardness as well as a celebration. And it took some years for these things to come to pass.
And how accurately do they think that they've actually recreated that cafe some 90 years later or whatever it was?
Well, I think it's. I mean, to be honest, I quite like the Cheers bar in Boston, which is a fake is fake heaped on a fake idea. So I'm a sucker for this kind of stuff anyway, regardless of its strict authenticity. I think the Central Cafe, the Café Central, is not exact. It's in the same building, but it's not exactly in the same place as it was before. So it doesn't look exactly the same. But I think it's more to give a kind of cop-out answer. It's more of a flavour or a feeling for it, rather than strict historical accuracy.
Thanks. You made me reminisce about going to Boston myself. It feels like the Cavern Club of Liverpool as well. You know, all these places that unfortunately, you know, either don't exist anymore and got rebuilt or whatever, but it's still a spiritual place to go and visit when you go to these places. Okay, so we'll start with the questions. In fact, we'll go straight through it. We have a hand up. Give me one moment. I'll get there. Piers, I'll just put you onto ask your question. Please ask your question.
Hi there, Dr. Perkins. I was just wondering about Vienna cafe culture in comparison to Paris cafe culture. I'm thinking about the Café de Fleury and why perhaps Vienna cafe culture was different in those days as opposed to Vienna. What was so special about Vienna?
I think it is because Vienna was such a small size, and they had that tradition of cafes. And as I think I said earlier, Vienna sort of resembled, it was more like 18th century London than then contemporary London. It still had that kind of small town feel to it. And it was possible, as I said, for people to kind of, you know, Freud walked daily on the Ringstrasse. It was easily possible for him to walk into Adolf Hitler, though history doesn't record that meeting. But so, and a lot of, because I suspect also people's flats, I know that people's flats were kind of rather unwelcoming, and they went to the cafes for warmth, a bit like the author of Harry Potter in a different way. And they came together and kind of bounced off each other for that reason. So I think it's a kind of a peculiarity I think that the Viennese coffee house, properly done, is a kind of a thing of a beauty, really. So, but they don't really serve fast coffee.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Piers. Okay, but we've got a couple more hands up before we go to another hand. I'll just there's a related question from Jean as well. In the 1920s, the cafe culture was it rather like Bloomsbury set in London? Is that hold some similarities?
I mean, I think yeah, obviously the Vienna suffered with the World War II with a profound reduction in. I mean, it suffered worse than Germany. So there's serious economic problems. They're trying to keep it all going, but one of the things that had created this kind of cultural flowering was a new form of politics, which is often a kind of populist anti-Semitic politics, and you can see that increasing throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. So the culture has become more difficult. I think there are some comparisons. Still, they're trying to keep that culture going, but obviously, many of the participants are going to leave Austria in the 1930s, or in some cases commit suicide.
Excellent, thank you. Andrew, please ask your question of Dr. Perkins.
My question is, are there any parallels or differences between fin de siècle Vienna and fin de siècle Berlin?
I mean, I think that Vienna was kind of overlooked in some ways and became a thing, partly because Schiele was actually thinking about America in the 1950s, and he was thinking about the decline of American liberalism and the development of new forms in politics and the dominance of Freudian culture in America. So part of the story of Schiele's work is a kind of a history of America in another way. Certainly, and Vienna became this huge thing. But then more recently, people have looked more to a kind of Central European cultural flowering, because it doesn't make any sense just to say Vienna is a thing on its own. And obviously, you've got people like Kafka, who come in from Prague now again to give go to insurance conferences and give talks on accident prevention. But there's a kind of flowering of culture in Prague and in Krakow, also in Berlin. So the idea, this kind of gleaming idea that Schiele had, it's a very kind of Viennese thing, has perhaps been challenged in recent times. So, and people like Koshka spend more time in Berlin and in a way become more identified with German expressionism.
Oh, thanks, Dr. Perkins. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for your question. Okay, so next question we have, can you recommend any good books to read about Viennese culture?
Well, I think that Schiele is the one to start with. That is the kind of classic one. I mean, I said he wasn't the first one. Stefan Zweig, the very famous German author, wrote a book called The World of Yesterday, which is kind of one of the original books here. There was a book called Sacred Spring in the 1970s. Also an interesting book called Wittgenstein's Vienna by Yannick and Tullman.
Thank you. Okay. I want to ask, do you think the new architectural style could have happened without the experimentation within art and vice versa?
I mean, certainly architects like Otto Wagner sort of hero worship Klimt. If you believe the kind of Schorskian analysis as a kind of shift away from the patterns of history to new forms, and there is that experimentation and a kind of brutalism, but it's not quite the same. One of the reasons as what we might expect from the kind of stereotypical ideas of the 1960s architecture in the UK, obviously one of the reasons why some of the Wittgenstein designed a house for his sister, the Lowe's house, is that they just build it out of better materials. So I think to answer the question, there is a kind of a feedback between the artists and the architects. I mean, Lowe's got his ideas from the USA, but there is a kind of positive feedback loop, I think.
Thanks, David. Alexander asks, is Hitler thinkable without his Vienna experience? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, Hitler's is like, I don't know, Hitler's kind of hard to track down, and he's a kind of creation. He's other people's ideas in a way. He's kind of a creature of other people. Later, he one of the founders of the NSDAP, a guy called, is it Dietrich Eckart, I think he is, kind of takes him on board and creates his style and kind of shapes him into a new thing. But I think there is definitely an argument that he kind of, there was a big divisions about immigration, particularly of Jews coming in from the eastern part of the empire. Hitler felt his genius hadn't been recognized, and he kind of, there were lots of anti-Semitic newspapers. He kind of drank into this whole atmosphere, certainly, but he kind of went back and kind of edited his history, as I said. So sometimes it's a little bit hard to track down, but maybe it's a bit of both, if I had to give a fence-sitting answer.
George asks, why was Vienna the city which had such a variety and depth of artistic and intellectual activity in that period?
I think again, it kind of, some of it's accident, some of it's the small size. It's just that I don't know, sometimes it's a bit like, I don't know, I don't want to draw a false comparison, but like tech hubs, you know, you kind of get a whole bunch of people together there at Old Street Roundabout or in California, wherever, and they all just kind of feed off each other, and it just becomes a thing. And the genesis and dynamics of this is not always easy to kind of track down, I think. But there are people tended to kind of, not people tended to, but you get people who kind of straddle different fields. So, for instance, you've got the economist Schumpeter, who left notes for an unfinished novel where he writes it, the protagonist goes to America to get into business, and not because he's interested in making money, but it's kind of the philosophical idea of the dynamics of capitalism. So you get people involved like Musil, who's a trained engineer, Wittgenstein, who's an engineer. People cross-fertilize in different areas, I think, to a large extent.
Thank you. Elizabeth asks, I noticed that Gustav Klimt wasn't branded as degenerate during the Nazis' vendetta against art that wasn't to their liking. Do you have an idea as to why he escaped unscathed?
I think because there was an exhibition during the war of his, I think it's Adele Blockbauer, the golden Adele Blockbauer, and they kind of edited out the Jewish background to it. They just called it the Golden Woman or something like that. And so I think they just, again, it's a kind of form of editing. And because he wasn't Jewish himself, you know, he was kind of acceptable. And he was not, I suppose also Klimt wasn't really, he was a kind of a happy rebel against society. You know, he made a lot of commissions. You know, he was revered, and he was on the, I mean, some of his paintings went a bit too far and they scandalized people, particularly early on, but he kind of, people kind of liked his slightly smutty paintings.
Thank you. Cameron, one of our shows, asked sort of what drew you to study Vienna opposed to other European cities?
Well, I guess you got to study one thing as opposed. I fell into it because I did a course at university on it, and it was kind of a mind-blowing course because it wasn't just political history. It was like, this is the history of everything, and it just really kind of expanded my perception, and I became a bit of an enthusiast for it. And I've kind of, although I've kind of specialized in other things, I've kind of come back to it now and again, and I've had trips to Vienna and so forth.
Max asks, can you tell me something about the Mikokirche church? It's stunning inside, but I know a little bit about its background, its history.
I mean, it dominates the place. I don't actually. I'm just having an adventure in dementia, I'm afraid. I can't remember the first thing about it. To be honest, I'm just gonna have to stick my hand up and say that now. It dominates the square. I've walked past it so many times, but again, I just think I'm gonna have to pass that one, I'm afraid.
You're doing really well, David. That's fantastic. Look, Piers, we're going to allow you to talk. Piers, please ask your question.
Hi there, Dr. Perkins. Could you just tell us about the position of Austrian Jews at this time, where they were? I'm teaching a module at the moment on this, and what they were considered in society. Were they considered differently, or how they sat in Austrian society at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a kind of a great hope of integration from the 1860s, 1870s. After the stock market crash of 1873, things change, and there's a loss of faith in progress. You get the rise of popularist movements, anti-Semitic movements, the shift from cultural anti-Semitism to a kind of more biological anti-Semitism. You can't actually change who you are what you are, according to this kind of distortion of racial theory. So Jews had a sort of unusual position. I mean, Freud struggled to get to be in this new atmosphere of populist anti-Semitic politics. Freud struggled to secure an associate professorship. He's about 45 or 46. So there's a definite feeling of discrimination. The mayor of Vienna of the Christian Social Party, who's often seen as a kind of precursor to Hitler, kind of did play on this anti-Semitic stuff, and he set up the Post Office Savings Bank, which is a nice building, but it's also trying to undercut what they regarded as being Jewish financial interests. So, but he basically famously said, "I decide who's a Jew." He says, "Well, you know, I've got lots. How come you got lots of Jewish friends?" Well, you know, I decide who's a Jew. But he kind of, I suppose, he set that off, and it's going to have tragic consequences in the future.
Thanks very much for your question, Piers. Georgia asked, you said there were many innovators that were Jewish. Was there no anti-Semitism feeling at the time, sort of similar sort of lines?
I mean, definitely against Mala, for sure, yeah. He had a very difficult time. So I think so, I mean, some of the purchase, I mean, like the Wittgenstein family come from a Jewish background, and they're sponsoring the secession building. The Wittgensteins buy Klimt's canvases. So some of the art market is I don't want to exaggerate this, but some of it is there are Jewish kind of sponsors of it. So I don't know too much about that, to be honest, but I mean, certainly there is a feeling of scandal, and it's not helped by the artist being Jewish, certainly.
Andrew writes, thank you, David. Been to Wien once on a young enterprise trip and loved it. One thing that struck me was the subservience. You could come across a road with no cars inside, or would normally cross it. No local would dare to do so unless there was a green light. Do you think there is a reason for this?
I think that there's always been a tension between the kind of socialist Vienna, the kind of working class Vienna, red Vienna, and the kind of more buttoned down conservative Vienna, and those things kind of exist in tension with each other. I suppose I don't want to make large scale assertions necessarily, but you know, Germanic cultures tend to be kind of more rule abiding, do they not? They've got rules about when they can hang their washing out and so on and so forth. So maybe that's the reason. I don't know.
Thanks. And Barbara says, how did Vienna culture influence science? What was its influence on the Vienna Circle, Wittgenstein, and part of it? I've focused on the kind of cultural, artistic elements, but yeah, obviously, someone like me, it's easy to forget that there's a kind of important scientific developments as well. In you've got Mach here of the Mach number, you've got Boltzmann, you've got developments in radiology and medicine, and you've got characters like Robert Musil, who's a trained engineer, Wittgenstein, who's an engineer, and makes some developments to aircraft engines, I think. And then move into different spheres. So I've kind of lost the thread of the question, but but hopefully that's some kind of answer. Vienna culture influence on science.
Oh, the Vienna culture influence on science. I think I think again. Actually, I don't know.
In fact, Barbara, is your question? Do you want to elaborate any further?
I would like to a little bit, because my great-grandfather is Moritz Schlick, and he was part of the Vienna circle that Wittgenstein was part of. And I know that he exchanged, for example, mail with Einstein. So there's a lot of history there, but I think he arrived in Vienna in 1922, so a little bit later, and he was murdered on the steps of the university in 1936. So I would love to kind of learn more about pretty much anything that was going on around the period that my great-grandfather lived there.
Sure. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't. It's quite random, but
yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. But I'm afraid I don't really.
That's fine.
Have anything to offer there, I'm afraid.
Thank you for your thanks for your question, Barbara. Can I just we'll go, Adrian. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. The modern day economist Piketty, I think he looks at this period and identifies it as being characterized by a large disparity in wealth, which mirrors to some extent where we are at the moment, and possibly even going further back to the Regency period. Do you think there's anything in this in terms of there being a sort of excess disposable incomes to feed culture in this way?
I think yes. Obviously, artists tend to need a market. If you believe the kind of Shorsky kind of theory, many of them, I mean, it's not a completely watertight theory, but a number of them are the sons of people who've been in business who are now alienated from society, and they now turn away from business and from politics. Because I think, to an example from business, the two of the Wittgenstein brothers committed suicide because they wanted to do other things, but their father was putting on intense pressure on them to go into the kind of business world. And I think, I mean, yeah, undoubtedly there was a huge disparity in wealth. There's no doubt about that. And I think the market, and it was a rather unusual kind of patron kind of centered kind of art market, yeah.
Do you think there's any parallel today in the art market? And
I don't know. I'm not particularly active in the art market. I don't have a Chagall in my downstairs toilet, but I do. I think there probably are some. I'm sure there are parallels. Definitely, the same sort of things seem to be happening. And when a few years ago, when Adolf Bloch-Bauer's painting came on the market again, having been recovered from having been stolen by the Nazis, it commanded millions of dollars. So it still has an attraction today. So I think there are undoubtedly disparities in wealth. I suppose when you look at the kind of Viennese school of economists, are they rooted in their period, or are they saying things that are kind of, if not exactly timeless, then maybe axiomatic? Maybe they would claim there's something that goes above and beyond. They're not completely trapped by their environment.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you for your question. Charles asks, how many ethnic groups were in Vienna during this period, and how did that affect the culture at the time?
Well, there's a very large number of ethnic groups. I had in my mind to actually, because I had in my mind to check that up. But obviously, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is a very large, diverse, multinational empire with a whole range of different language groups. Many of them are loggerheads at this time, including Czech nationals, Hungarians. The whole thing is going to split apart after the war into a whole set of new states. There's going to be lots of Jews coming in from the eastern parts of the empire who are going to be dressed in kaftans, you know, and they have that kind of different look that makes people kind of suspicious. So definitely, it's very much, there's some quite vicious anti-Semitic cartoons at the time, and generally, and the Karl Lueger, the Christian social mayor of Vienna, is active in campaigning against immigration into Vienna. I think he coined the term Judah pest to he's some pretty stark stuff going on.
Thank you. And could you tell us a little bit more about, you've gone through so many different interdisciplinary elements of cultural Vienna. Why did this happen there?
I suppose at that stage, life wasn't quite as specialized as it is now. Now people tend to kind of hold up in very narrow specialisms, and they can't really keep track of all the technical specialist literature in their area, let alone the idea that they're going to. And I think it still was just about possible for educated people to have kind of read all the major books and to be able to swap in between different areas in a way that it's not possible now. Particularly, technology has helped us, but it's also led to a kind of exponential growth in the amount of material that we've got to deal with.
Yeah, and Eleanor, that was a great question from Anthony. And Alan asked, how did the Spanish flu sort of affect the intellectual exchange of these ideas? You mentioned people like the death of Schiele, etc.
Yeah, Schiele and Klimt were swept away by the Spanish flu. I mean, obviously, it was those are the two people I can think of off the top of my head who suffered in that. I think Schille's wife also died in it, but obviously in these COVID days, it's a kind of, because people kind of forgotten about the impact of, people knew about 1918 flu pandemic, they kind of knew about it in a kind of abstract way, but people are kind of revisiting now and looking at it a bit more closely than they have done, I suppose. And I think the empire came to an end. The whole multinational empire was split apart. There's huge economic, social, political problems, psychological problems left over from the war. It's a facet of a larger story, but it's a pretty important facet, I think. People were really in a very bad state in the late teens, early 20s.
Fantastic. And just one or two more questions to finish off. And William asked, was Vienna sublimely isolated from the rest of the Habsburg Empire, or was it characterized and strongly influenced by it?
I think you can. I suppose it comes back to whether you think there's something unique about Vienna, or whether it's more part and parcel of a Central European kind of flowering. But certainly you do seem to see Art Nouveau buildings. You can see a bit across the empire, and you see people have done studies to look at the connections, and you can see artists in the Czech lands, in Slovenia as well, where you also see buildings of this type. So I think there are, and as I said, you've got people like coming in from different parts of the empire, like Kafka springs to mind, who are part of a kind of German-speaking culture, which kind of ties that thing into Vienna, I suppose.
Thanks, David. I'm going to have the last question here. So eventually, when COVID's over and you get that flight over to Vienna, where do you go first? That is actually
a good question. I might go to the Café Landmann, which is near the university, which is one of Freud's regular hangouts, and then I might, imitating Freud, I might take a little walk around the Ringstrasse.
I can see you there right now. There were quite a few other questions and actually quite a lot of comments in the Q&A. Thanking you so much, David, for your insights and on Vienna in the early 20th century. I've gained a lot about Schille's and Gerstel's sort of almost harrowing pictures, actually, paintings and what they did there with the portraits, and dare I say, is it the fiendish relationships that Alma sort of had? The various relationships there. Is that the right word or not?
Well, I don't know. I mean, they're all as mad as a box of frogs, these people, and Alma, they're just extreme. Koshka's got a life-size model of which he takes around with him everywhere, and then eventually he sort of decapitates it to try and get out of his system. Every painting he paints is always every female form is rendered with the image, with the kind of with the features of Alma. She, as I said, she has this reputation for being flighty and everything else, but you know, she was quite talented, and Mahler had stopped her from composing, and maybe she's just conforming to the kind of stereotype at the time, and she's trying to carve out her own world. I mean, she becomes quite grouchy later on, but fortunately she manages to emigrate to the United States, and after some diciness getting out of Europe. So she had quite a ride, really. But I think, you know, and she's one of the survivors, as with Bambi, she's one of the survivors of if I'm not being too flippant there, of that whole world, because she lasts until 64, I think.
Fantastic.
Koshka.
Yeah. I look forward to having a cup of tea and hearing more stories about Vienna when we get a chance in the common room, David. It's been absolutely fascinating hearing your insights, and you handled the questions incredibly well. There's quite a diverse range of questions there, and you've done it extremely well. So thank you for your time on behalf of everybody listening, and we really appreciate the time you gave. Thank you, David.